Most solved mysteries have a solution that is somewhat expected. The most obvious answer is usually the correct one. But that isn't always the case, and some of the scariest solved mysteries have unexpected answers. Number 5. In 2021, a Croatian fisherman stumbled across a strange mystery when he discovered a badly wounded woman on an inaccessible island in the Adriatic Sea. The fisherman was on his boat when he spotted the woman standing on a rocky outcrop off the coast of the Isle of Kirk. The rocks were extremely sharp, and the man feared his boat would be damaged if he got any closer. But the woman was waving for help, so he contacted authorities and a rescue mission was sent out. The woman was extremely dehydrated. She'd been on the small island for days without food or water. By the time she was found, she barely had the strength to drink anything. The discovery revealed a number of mysteries, but the most pressing was who this woman was. She claimed to have no memory of who she was or how she wound up on the island. She spoke English like a professor, according to those that found her, so it was assumed she was a tourist of some kind. But when police went to hotels where tourists frequented, nobody recognized her. Police made an appeal to the press for information, and the story made headlines around the world. The strange mystery of the woman's identity was solved by people from the United States. A number of people from the US recognized the mystery woman as Daniela Adamkova. Daniela was a Slovakian jewelry maker who had created works for a number of Hollywood stars, and even had her work appear on the sitcom Friends. She'd lived in the US for decades before leaving in 2015 and briefly moving to Ireland. Friends in Croatia and Slovakia also confirmed Daniela's identity. They said that she'd like to travel alone, so even though she didn't live in Croatia, it wasn't exactly unsurprising for her to be there. Other tourists on Kirk said that they'd seen her on the Dalmatian coast. She told them she was traveling alone too. Now the only mystery that remained was how Daniela had found herself on the island in the first place. Locals claim only a strong swimmer would have been able to make it to the island, and there was nothing there that anybody would want to see. Daniela had been there at least one night, as the same fisherman who had called for her rescue had seen her there the day before. The day before, she had simply been walking on the beach and didn't seem to be in any distress. Rescuers thought she had been there longer. Eventually, some of Daniela's memories returned, and she would later claim that she had been kidnapped. She described 2 men and a woman that dragged her from a boat onto the island. She also claimed she didn't remember how she had gotten to Croatia though, and the last thing she remembered before being taken to the island was someone ringing the doorbell of her home in Slovakia. She believes her kidnappers thought she was no longer alive, as she awoke beneath a blanket. Croatian police do not believe foul play was involved, so the mystery of how Daniela ended up on the island remains unsolved. Number 4. For more than a century, the mystery of what happened to a famed British explorer in the far north of the globe was a terrifying thought for anybody considering a search for the elusive Northwest Passage. Even as we entered modern times, and a route through the north of Canada was successfully navigated, what happened to the Franklin expedition remained a mystery. In some ways, the truth about what happened to the more than 100 men who disappeared on the ice shouldn't have been much of a surprise. It was a story that had been passed down through Inuit oral history for generations, but it was something none of Franklin's Victorian peers could have expected. In May of 1845, Sir John Franklin left England with a crew of 110 men and 23 officers. He'd been to the Arctic numerous times and had almost lost his life on at least one occasion. This time, he was determined to find a route from the North Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, a route that would cut a large chunk of time from trade journeys to Asia. The 2 ships were equipped with enough food for 3 years, sealed in tin cans, a relatively new invention. But the expedition rapidly went downhill. Even before they reached uncharted territory, the expedition lost a number of men to a mysterious disease. Then the ships became locked in ice. The men spent a winter on board the ships, waiting for the ice to melt in the spring. All the time, the mysterious illness was claiming more and more lives. In the spring, the ice didn't melt. Eventually, the men made the decision to abandon ship. They took lifeboats and pulled them across the ice. As they made the journey south, they passed groups of Inuit. Back in England, Sir Franklin's wife called for an expedition to find her husband, even before the 3 years were up. When the Victorians finally arrived in what is today's northern Canada, they met with the same Inuit groups who told stories of the ships sinking into the ice and the missing men dragging their boats on the ice. One especially terrifying story was of an Inuit man boarding one of the abandoned ships and finding a large man sat in the cabin. The man was no longer alive but had a disturbing grin on his face. But the Victorians didn't take the stories to be truth, because they included the fact that the men seemed to be consuming their fellow sailors. The Victorians couldn't believe that British sailors would do such a thing. For decades, the search continued, and some remains and scraps of fabric were found, but the majority of the men remained lost. Eventually, other matters became more pressing and the search was abandoned. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the public became interested in finding the lost expedition. Analysis of the remains that had been found indicated that the men had suffered from lead poisoning, possibly from the cans of food. This explained why they had apparently done irrational things, like head away from where they knew there would be help, and why the notes and letters that were found seemed to be so chaotic. Some remains also showed signs of tool marks, proving that the Inuit people had been correct about what the sailors had been eating. It wasn't until 2014 that one of the ships was finally found. HMS Erebus, the lead ship, was found in shallow water south of King William Island. Again, this was almost exactly where the old oral history had said the ship would be found. 2 years later, the second ship, HMS Terror, was also found. The ships were in relatively good condition, though the front portion of Erebus was destroyed by ice. It was here that the Inuit claimed to see the grinning man, which may well have been Franklin himself. Explorations of the ship are yet to take place, and a more definitive answer of what really happened has yet to be found, but most of this scary mystery has now been solved. Number 3. In 2013, one of the oldest Cold War mysteries was solved by a group of researchers in Hawaii. The sinking of a Japanese submarine was arguably one of the first acts in the build-up to the Cold War, as tensions rose between two countries that had just months earlier been allies. The I-400 was one of the most incredible and terrifying submarines. To this day, it remains one of the largest non-nuclear submarines ever built. It completely changed the perceptions of what submarine warfare could be. Up until it was built, submarines were mostly used to sink surface ships and other submarines, but the I-400 had much bigger targets. The I-400 was a Sentoku-class submarine and represented a terrifying threat that could have entirely changed the face of the war. The sub could travel 1.5 times around the world without refueling, and carried 3 planes on board. In a matter of minutes, it would rise from beneath the sea, launch a plane, and disappear back underwater. It could carry 3 such planes, and the original goal for the Japanese was to create an entire fleet of the Sentoku submarines. With them, they could launch an attack on the US mainland, but only 3 could be built before the end of the war. In 1945, the US captured 3 submarines, including the I-400. A lot is said about the technology acquired when German scientists were captured, but having this submarine technology was a real win for the US. It was an advantage they couldn't let the Soviet Union take away. When the USSR requested access to the I-400, the US declined to use the sub as target practice and sunk it. They allegedly had no record of where the remains of the sub lay. For decades, the location remained a mystery. When, in the 1990s, researchers began to search for the submarine, they expected to find it far out at sea. Researchers were surprised to find the I-400 not too far off the coast of the island of Oahu. It was completely unexpected, but submersibles were able to determine that was the boat that they were looking for. Number 2. With every advancement in technology, scientists find new mysteries when they look out into our solar system and beyond. One scary mystery that has remained unsolved for more than 40 years concerned the biggest planet to revolve around our star. Every 27 minutes, a burst of electromagnetic light surrounds the poles of Jupiter. Like Earth, Jupiter has auroras, which form a spectacular light show above the planet. But Jupiter's light show was not like anything seen on Earth. For starters, Jupiter's auroras were much more regular. On Earth, auroras such as the Northern Lights are caused when streams of ionized particles from the sun hit our atmosphere. They travel along our magnetic field lines to the North and South Pole, where interactions with gases in our atmosphere produce the spectacular light shows. The particles are usually from solar storms, so auroras aren't regular. Auroras like this have been witnessed on other planets in our solar system, but none were as regular as Jupiter's. The other difference was the type of light emitted. While we get the beautiful green and blue visible light, Jupiter's poles see X-ray light being emitted. It's hard to imagine how terrifying it would be for the sky to light up with highly charged X-rays every half an hour here on Earth. But observations of Jupiter showed this was a constant occurrence on the planet. It wasn't until 2021 that scientists really solved the mystery of what was causing Jupiter's auroras. It wasn't just Jupiter's size that caused the strange occurrences, nor that one of its moons spewed ionized particles from its surface. Scientists were surprised to discover that Jupiter's magnetic field vibrates. Ionized particles surf on these vibrations and are at much higher speeds when they reach the poles. The high speeds result in more energy as they hit Jupiter's atmosphere, causing the X-rays. There's still a lot of work to be done to completely solve this scientific mystery. Scientists still don't know what causes Jupiter's magnetic field to vibrate, but they believe these X-ray auroras might be a common occurrence on other planets too. Number 1. The final moments of John F. Kennedy's life are still to this day filled with mysteries, and attract the attention of conspiracy theories even decades later. One of the more disturbing mysteries from the day was solved more than 15 years after the president lost his life. It would turn out to not be nearly as dark as originally thought. After Lee Harvey Oswald took Kennedy's life, the US government began an in-depth investigation. With so many people carrying cameras that day, there was plenty of footage to analyze. It was here that investigators found a figure that appeared out of place. Almost everyone who had gathered to watch Kennedy's motorcade travel through Dallas, Texas, was dressed for a bright November day. So a man dressed in a long black coat carrying a black umbrella looked very out of place. For those looking back at the tapes, knowing what was to come, he seemed to be a disturbing omen. But things only got weirder as Kennedy's car passed. The man raised his umbrella and appeared to wave it slightly, as if signaling something. Moments later, Oswald would fire the bullet that would claim Kennedy's life. Investigators put out an appeal for information about the man. He seemed too strange for it all to be a coincidence, especially seeing as any signal he was sending would have been easily seen by Oswald. It took 15 years for the man to come forward. Texas resident Louis Stephen Witt confessed to being the Umbrella Man. He had nothing to do with the crime that would take place that day, and hadn't realized how controversial his presence would be. Louis explained that he'd been using the umbrella to heckle Kennedy. It had been done before, including a time when a group of school children had sent a black umbrella to the president after the construction of the Berlin Wall. It was meant to reference Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister at the start of the Second World War. Chamberlain had tried to appease Hitler by agreeing to let him take land in Europe. When appeasement failed, the black umbrella Chamberlain was known to carry was used by cartoonists and protesters to mock the Prime Minister. Kennedy's father had been a supporter of Chamberlain, and it was known the umbrella jab annoyed Kennedy. Louis wasn't a huge fan of Kennedy's politics, as he thought the president was too liberal, so he had come to Dallas that day to try to heckle him, never knowing how many conspiracies he would spark. It wasn't until 15 years later that he learned just how much drama his small action had caused. He hadn't seen any of the news reports or books speculating on his identity. When he found out, he admitted that he'd been worried about what people might think of him, but he did eventually come forward and no action was taken against him. It would turn out the Umbrella Man hadn't been a terrifying, mysterious omen of tragedy, but a case of someone being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.